So I've mentioned that you need to do a forensic examination of your own business and the need to clean it up. This is the point where you get to lift the drains on your company, to kill the slugs but leave the snails, as I said earlier. So let's start with a to-do list. I'm a former private pilot, and I was taught something called a Bumfari pre-landing check, which stands for brakes, undercarriage, mixture, fuel and flaps, altimeter, radio and instruments. Here, I'm going to give you a Bumfari check for cleaning up your business. So, B is for board, and in particular, board meeting minutes. Do you have them? Have the actions from the last 3 meetings been completed? If you don't have them, start taking them at board meetings. You do have board meetings, right? As this shows potential buyers how well the business is managed and governed. These minutes were the first things that I asked for in due diligence when buying any company. Of course, if you're the only director, you may not see the need for a board meeting, but they are good discipline to get into, as the minutes will detail the strategic decisions that you've taken. U is for USP, your unique selling proposition. Some people call this a unique selling point, incorrectly in my view, as a proposition can be made up of more than one point. Regardless, you need to get very clear and focused on your USP, because it's the bedrock of the information memorandum, or teaser document, that's sent out to potential buyers. In other words, it's the hook that gets you noticed. M is for management and maintenance. So are any trade body or national or ISO accreditations up to date, for example? Are your leases up to date, or are they coming up for renewal on things like buildings, cars and equipment? What are the dates and the break clauses? Miss one of these and you, not the buyer, could end up paying to get out of the lease once the deal is done. Your website is the first thing a potential buyer is going to look at, so check it carefully and then check it again. There must be no broken links and no typos. Do you have copyright notices on your website? If not, add them. If you do they have the right dates? Do you have privacy and terms and conditions pages? Again, if not, add them, and if you do they need updating? F is for financials. So this is where I want to examine your sales figures. Are they rising or falling or static? How good is your credit control? Do you need more stringent credit checks? That's both on clients and suppliers. One thing you don't need is a big client or supplier going bankrupt while you're in the middle of the exit process, because it's going to have a big impact on the numbers and thus the valuation of your company. Look closely at controlling and managing your costs. I'm not suggesting that you cut everything to the bone. Remember, you're killing the slugs, not the snails, and you need to let the buyer see that there's some fat here that they can cut out. But on the other hand, if as a buyer I see costs running out of control, then that's going to worry me about buying your business, because I'll be wondering what else you've not got a handle on. And finally, if you're selling big ticket items, particularly goods rather than services, is it worth getting or updating your bad debt insurance? A is for assets, and by this I don't mean everything on your balance sheet. I want you to focus on people and intellectual property. Your people are probably your most important asset, and as you're one of your people, you are one of your most impressive and important assets. So what can you be doing now? Well, you can be networking. Networking to find potential buyers, networking to find potential professional partners, or just networking to find people to bounce ideas off. Never underestimate the importance of networking in the exit process. Here's another left field idea for you. Join the committee of a charity if you haven't already done so, not as the chair or leader, but as a humble member. The downside of this is that your fellow committee members are often not business people, and so as a consequence, decision-making tends to happen a lot more slowly than you're used to, which can be seriously frustrating. The upside of this is that it'll prepare you for the frustrations you'll experience in the sale process. Think about the composition of your board of directors. You may have a one-man board, i.e. just you, or you may have several members. Either way, it's a good idea to swap roles in the boardroom to get a feel how different roles view and think about a situation. This is even true if it's just you. If you remember, I mentioned earlier the effect 9/11 had on my last exit. If I'd had a board member who'd been killed, injured or incapacitated in that disaster, then if we'd swapped roles, as I'm suggesting, at least I'd have had a feel for what I might need to do to fill in as a short-term contingency while I either waited for them to get better or I found a replacement. Having a contingency plan always pleases a potential buyer, as it shows that you think about risk and risk management. Take a good hard look at your management team. Make sure that they're fit for purpose. Do they need some training to help them get better? Do you have some managers coming up to retirement? Might it make sense to offer them early retirement so that you can bring in fresh blood? People nearing retirement, from a buyer's point of view, can be seen as a cost because the buyer needs to find the replacement. If you're proactive in doing this, you can make that part of your sales pitch, explaining that you've done this now to help the buyer going forwards. I suspect it'll be appreciated. What do your employment contracts look like? Are they in order and fit for purpose, taking account of any new legislation that might have occurred since they were drafted? I've seen too many deals get close to collapse when it turned out that there were gaps in the employment contracts, or they were not drafted in a way that was suitable for the business going forwards. Do you have some key members of staff that you can't afford to lose, particularly if doing so could derail the exit process? If so, how about granting them share options? For those not familiar with the term, a share option is the right to earn or buy shares at a pre-agreed price at a specific point in time, which is often the exit. The grant of options does not dilute the existing shareholders until the option is executed, or vests as it is known. I highly recommend that if you go down this path, the participants in the scheme and or the number of options granted are kept secret so as not to create a culture of jealousy. Believe me, people tend to get very upset if they find out, which will lead to a breakdown in trust between you and your team. Finally, and crucially, if you have multiple shareholders, I beg you, get a shareholder agreement in place if you haven't done so already. Why? Well, you remember my point earlier about enforced exits. So what happens if you want to sell and a minority shareholder doesn't, or you can't agree on a deal valuation? A shareholder agreement should contain what's known as a drag-along clause to determine what happens in this situation. With no such agreement, you'll be in for a lot of expensive conversations with lawyers to agree a deal between the shareholders before you even start negotiating with the buyer. So let's now talk about intellectual property, or IP. IP is incredibly valuable, so you really do need to know where it is. Can you touch all of yours? What do I mean by that? Well, do you need to have trademarks? Do you need to have registered trademarks? Do you need to have patents? Even if the answer to those is no, is your IP documented well enough that a buyer can understand it when they own the business? I'm not suggesting you give it to them as part of due diligence, but you will need to give assurances that your IP is yours and that you can teach or show the buyer how it all works when they end up owning your business. These will end up as warranty clauses in any final sale and purchase agreement. R is for resources. One of your biggest resources is your supply chain, so make sure that there are no kinks in it. And again, make sure that everybody in your supply chain is financially sound so that they don't go bust just when you're trying to exit. Look at your routes to market. For me, this involves examining both your distribution channels and the type of clients that you sell to, and whether both are fit for the future projection of your company after you've left. So be prepared to explain these to the buyer. Now is the time to set up your digital data room, where you'll store all the information that's going to be needed during the due diligence process. This is likely to be a lot of data, including things like employment contracts, HR policies, supply contracts, client contracts, your IP stuff, etc., etc. Start gathering all this together into a data room now so that you don't end up doing it in a rush when the actual exit process starts. And believe you me, once that process starts, it's all too easy to forget stuff. So get it into a data room now. And finally, I is for indicators. If you haven't got one, investigate an online dashboard option, or just create a simple tracking system in a spreadsheet or a Word document, or whatever allows you to monitor the key performance indicators for your business, be that gross profit or staff turnover or the number of new customers or the number of customers that you've lost, so on and so forth. The key thing here is to remember the point I made earlier about keeping it simple. And again, expect to share this in due diligence. As part of this process, you need to lift the drains to see what crawls out. Knowing what's there means that a potential buyer can't throw you a curveball during the negotiations with a question about something that you'd completely forgotten about. So lift the drains now, remembering to kill the slugs and not the snails. This is probably the best point to mention interim management. If you need somebody to close off a problem found while you've been lifting those drains, rather than making a full-time hire, you can get an interim on a fixed-term contract to sort out that specific problem. The difference between interims and consultants is that interims are part of your firm. Interim directors take a temporary seat on your board with all the legal risks to themselves that this entails. They're effectively temporary specialist staff, whereas consultants often have their own agendas. I'm a huge fan of interims. I've used them for a lot of clients. It wasn't something that was around when I was running my companies, but I can think of a couple of instances where I would have hired an interim in a heartbeat. Here's yet another left field idea. How about buying a company before you sell yours? That way you get to see the process from the other side, and you can learn from sellers' mistakes how to make your company more attractive to a buyer in the future. Let me leave you with this thought on this slide. I believe it was Gary Player, the famous golfer, who said that the harder I practice, the luckier I get. Consider all this work and effort that you'll be putting in as your practice sessions, because the better you understand your business, the better the exit will go.